Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city, and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed and to say to him one after another, "Surely not I." He said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for him that he had not been born." While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I am raised up, I will go on before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all of them said the same. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you do not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a 3rd time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' But even on this point their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?' But he was silent and did not answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' All of them condemned him as deserving of death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him and to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophesy.' The guards took him also and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, 'You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth.' But he denied it, saying, 'I do not know or understand what you're talking about.' And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed, and the servant girl, on seeing him, began to say again to the bystanders, 'This man is one of them.' But again he denied it. Then after a little while the bystanders again said to Peter, 'Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean.' But he began to curse and swore an oath, 'I do not know this man that you're talking about.' At that moment the cock crowed for a second time. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, 'Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.' And he broke down and wept. Mark's story of Jesus last week moves towards its climax. On Wednesday, Jesus had been anointed for burial by a woman disciple and betrayed to the authorities by one of the 12 men closest to him. On Thursday, the events set in motion by Wednesday begin to unfold. Holy Thursday is full of drama. In the evening, Jesus eats a final meal with his followers and prays for deliverance in Gethsemane. He is betrayed by Judas, denied by Peter, and deserted by the rest. Arrested in the darkness, he is interrogated and condemned to death by the high priest and his council, the local collaborators with imperial authority. All of this happens before dawn on Friday. As Mark tells the story, Jesus knows what will happen. How could he not? He must have known that the noose was tightening, that the cross was approaching. He was not oblivious to the hostility of the authorities, and no doubt saw his arrest and execution as inevitable. We need to remember that Jesus had been repeatedly criticized for eating with tax collectors and sinners. The issue is that Jesus eats with undesirables, with the marginalized and outcast in a society which had sharp social boundaries. It had both religious and political significance. Religious because it was done in the name of the kingdom of God, and political because it affirmed a very different vision of society. As a Passover meal, Jesus' Last Supper resonates with the story of Exodus from Egypt, his people's story of their birth as a nation, a story of bondage and deliverance and liberation. It was their primordial narrative, the most important story they knew, because it was and still remains the celebration of God's greatest act of deliverance. Mark's version of the Last Supper leaves the connection to Passover implicit. What makes it explicit is the connection to Jesus' impending death, and it does so with the words of institution, familiar to us through their use in Holy Communion. The language of body and blood points to a violent death, and without that it would not have been possible to talk of Jesus' death as a blood sacrifice. The correlation between Jesus as the new Paschal Lamb and his final meal as the new Passover becomes possible. The point is neither suffering nor substitution, but participation with God through gift or meal. Turning to Jesus' arrest, again we have the theme of failed discipleship, as the disciples, seemingly untouched by his agitation and distress, are unable to support him through that night. Of course, Jesus does not want to go through with it. Who would? And yet he gives himself over to God. Not what I want, but what you want. I think we need to be clear that Jesus' death was not the will of God. It is never God's will that the righteous suffer. The prayer reflects not a fatalistic resignation to the will of God, but a trusting in God in the midst of the most dire of circumstances, as a forerunner to Peter, Paul, and all who have died as martyrs since. Judas now knows the plan for the rest of the evening. He has already left the meal, and now Jesus can be arrested in the darkness away from the crowd. We don't hear of Judas again. It is left to the other Gospels to explain that Judas has an attack of conscience and tries to return the blood money the religious authorities had paid him. It is left to Matthew to introduce Judas's suicide. So we reach the trial. We need to remember that according to Mark, there are no followers of Jesus there. Is the account of the trial a Markan construction, or can we summarize that a sympathizer at the trial later reported back? We also need to remember that the Sanhedrin, made up of collaborators as it was, didn't represent the view of the people who so far had been on Jesus' side. It's not a good start to the trial from the perspective of the authorities. The witnesses lie and disagree amongst themselves. It says something about the Sanhedrin's commitment to justice, that the trial went ahead from this point. However, in the absence of the 3 adult male witnesses who needed to agree for a charge to progress, the high priest goes for a direct confession and challenges Jesus one-to-one. In response to the question, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus responds, we are told, quoting Daniel, "With I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power." On this basis, Jesus is found guilty, and the high priest tears his robe as a sign that blasphemy has taken place. Jesus is condemned to death, and the emotional and physical abuse begins. He will now be handed over to Pilate. It is not yet daybreak. The end and the beginning are near.